Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and it's finally time to cap off our Ranger character list with the big one, the top 10 best Red Rangers. Now, by this point, most of you have heard me praise every other color up and down the spectrum, but as we know, this particular hue carries with it the largest burden of all. Not just being the leader of the team, usually, but also likely being the face of that particular season. Not every raid can carry that burden gracefully, if at all, which makes the 10 we do get to talk about here today all the more special. Worth re-emphasizing though is the fact that the order itself has never actually held that much importance to me. For this list in particular, if I could have named 4 number 1s, I'd do so. So no sense in getting too hung up on this ranger over that ranger. They're all great. They all bring something special to their team, their season, and the franchise as a whole. So, without further ado, let's talk about just how great they are. Connor is kind of a funny way to start off this list, as he perfectly represents the notion that things can always change as time marches on. When I originally discussed him in my Dino Thunder video, I directly stated that calling him a top 10 red would be a stretch, and yet, here we are. What it really comes down to is showrunners that knew how to embrace what Mighty Morphin did, update it, write it better, and upgrade the acting. The result is turning an unfocused, kind of sexist teenager with plenty of attitude into a true-to-form hero. Even with his big moment in episode 3 firmly establishing him as dedicated to the cause, what we see from him is patient, gradual growth. What we get from him when it's all said and done is someone who really did grow up, mature, see things in novel ways throughout their Ranger experience, including, but not limited to, his mini arc in the brilliant Lost in Translation episode. The entire team can lay claim to really good development, but I'd argue it's the most prevalent in Connor. He screwed up a lot while mostly being unaware he was doing anything wrong, but he grew past that, and just as importantly, he didn't act solely as Tommy's understudy ranger-wise. He got to prove on multiple occasions that he was a capable leader on top of an increasingly capable person. So yeah, toss out what I once said, cause Connor is a top 10 red. Jack serves as yet another great example of a very noticeably flawed person being given the keys to massive power and doing well to prove himself with it. And there's a lot of dynamics the show plays around with to create this arc for him. Initially, we see the type of potential he has for good, but isn't always able to see the bigger picture. That's where Z comes in. Her grand outlook, alongside their friendship, helps push Jack towards not only becoming a competent Red, but eventually doing something bigger in his own way. Kruger also plays a huge part in this, effectively challenging Jack to become the type of Red Doggy always knew he could be. And meeting Boom post-breakout, a man who flamed out of cadet training but still loves and appreciates the chance he got with S.P.D, was the perfect way for Jack to realize that maybe this organization really is about something greater. But nowhere are the character dynamics greater than with Sky himself. Almost half the season, if not more, is dedicated to the push and pull between these two, both of whom became great characters as a result. All capped off by Jack donating his morpher just so Sky can relish in a poetic victory. That's what great leadership looks like. And I'll always appreciate the fact that his growth led him not towards becoming a commander, but towards making his own choice about a life beyond S.P.D. A choice he more than earned. What oftentimes gets lost in the overly lengthy saga of the Mighty Morphin days is just how great a precedent they set for good characters. We all praise how great Adam, and especially Billy, were. But let's not forget that this franchise kicked off with a pretty great leader too. He didn't get the same type of development or arcs that a lot of his fellow Reds got, but the things we learned about him in just one episode were more than enough to carry him through most of the season. When things go south, he's usually the first man to genuinely want to make it right. When friends lose their way, he's the one literally reaching out and seeing the good. He listened to Zordon intently when no one else could be bothered, as if anxious for a chance to do something bigger in his own fairly downplayed way. But the thing that stuck out even more to me was the fact that he was a great leader because he was a great person, an effective teacher, and a great friend. He always struck me as seeing his job as leader as the burden it was, but embracing it anyway for the betterment of the team, something Boom Comics has done well to expand on. And while Mighty Morphin doesn't take it as far as they could, you kind of have to admire the type of guy whose first notable on-screen action is making sure Billy can grow as a person. The show, the franchise, simply wouldn't be as great without the example Jason set. Cole is one of the Rangers most ideally suited for the season he finds himself in. His big-hearted, genuine nature, even in the face of the cold sting of several realities, makes him the perfect counter to Master Org, who has also experienced the cold backhand of reality and responded in a much, much different way. And in a way, that really is his arc. He saw firsthand that Orgs didn't have hearts, but he kept fighting to save the world. He learned what the former Dr. Adler did to his parents, and yet he still refused to lose himself in a bid for revenge. That level of willpower is one of the most inspiring things to ever happen in this franchise, and it's easy to see how his teammates respond to that as well. Even Taylor learns to respect and accept what he brings as a leader early on, in spite of how dubious that transition is. And that's really my only issue with Cole. He never really gets to internalize the more structured approach most of his teammates embrace, so he never learns as much as he should. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, because he can fight through harsh reveals without losing himself, but he also doesn't change too much as a direct result of the team he's leading. Otherwise, he'd probably be top 5. But even with that, the end of Power Rangers is an all-time great season finale because of Cole. The perfectly bleak and hopeless setting, the loss of every Zord under the sun, the loss of their powers. Everything was being mercilessly stripped away by the man who turned himself into a monster. But even then, you still could never hope to cage the spirit of the Blazing Lion. That was a special moment, one that really only Cole could deliver, and Power Rangers is the better for it. Way too loud, way too stubborn, and commanding by rank and not respect, Scott Truman started off his journey as one of the worst characters in Power Rangers. He might actually have had a higher mountain to climb than even Sky did. But with both characters, you see the difference between them and someone like Nick Russell. And it's as simple as being able to empathize with their state of being by way of understanding how they got there. With Scott, it's all about his disciplined background and family dynamics. He's not the ideal leader. He wasn't even the ideal pilot by the time Venjik started ransacking the world, and his need to live up to his brother while also proving himself to his father manifests itself into a character who is too commanding, but does genuinely care somewhere underneath that hefty layer of hair. So now we understand Scott. So even if he never really adjusted his ways to become less authoritarian, we could still say he was a real character. But then he had to. Then his constant need to prove himself came to a head in Heroes Among Us. What makes this episode compelling is by this point, we're already intimately familiar with each and every way this mission could fail, because the Rangers had gone beyond the dome before. But we didn't need some heavy gotcha moment of Scott learning the error of his ways. Instead, Scott succeeds, but does so in a reckless and off-the-cuff manner he knew could have failed. Almost no season would think of forcing Scott to come to terms with his mistakes despite things turning out so well, and even receiving a medal for his efforts. This moment turns Scott from an empathetic character into a great ranger, and at no point after does he suddenly return to loud, obnoxious boss man. Rather, we see a much more team-friendly atmosphere up until the season ends. When they put their minds to it, this franchise excels at handling this specific character archetype, and the results speak for themselves. Kicking off the top 5 is the Ranger who both ushered in and was one of the focal points of the golden age of PR storytelling. What's really captured well of Andros is the mystery of the great beyond, and at the time unknown territory for Rangers, mixed in with his own storied, shady, and rather depressing history. And just like with Scott, except much less abrasive, we see a Ranger being properly characterized by way of taking a deep dive into his past. So when we talk about how Andros is presented, he isn't just this soft-spoken, somewhat standoffish, not from Earth human. His sister was taken right in front of him as a child. His best friend almost died right in front of him before any of this, and Lord only knows what happened to the other former Space Rangers. And that's really the smartest thing they did with Andros, presenting us with a Ranger who's been doing this for a while and has his own complicated history to sort through that's immediately relevant to almost every notable aspect of the story. And it doesn't stop there, as Andros' need to be guarded and reserved is also well highlighted by his extensive espionage missions. All this centered around a team that really was pushed in the ways they had to come together, what with no mentor here and needing to rely on a lot more than just butt kicking as a result. And in the end, Andros learns to trust people again, learns to connect to people again, to his humanity again. And in a story beat that Jungle Fury would go on to perfect, it places him in a position of believing in someone's capacity to be saved, even when his more wholesome teammates are against the idea. A fine arc for him, but it was the process of getting there that made him a Ranger legend. Leo Corbett is the man who both started and perfectly embodies my often mentioned idea of Rangers that shouldn't be there but make the most of the hand they've been dealt regardless. There are few Rangers as charming and charismatic as this one, and few Rangers still that come with such a well thought out character journey from beginning to end. And it all springs from Leo struggling with being worth his brother's sacrifice. That's what's constantly driving him towards being a better Ranger and a more capable leader. He doesn't get to just enjoy his merry little voyage through the stars anymore, and that made Destined for Greatness such a great episode to that end. Mike is back now, and technically, the Quasar Saber was originally his. Despite everything Leo had accomplished before this point, despite working hard enough to be worthy of Mike's trust in what could have been his final moments, he still doesn't feel worthy. But then, Mike helps him realize that maybe the Saber was always his to claim. And that's true. Not because the Saber made a mistake or something, but because Leo made it true, in spite of the Saber not originally picking him for this. That just might be the single best narrative Power Rangers has ever constructed, and it doesn't even stop there. Because just like Cole and Master Org, the story of Trakina is built in a way to parallel the journey Leo takes, fittingly, all coming to a head at Journey's end. By that point, Leo had seen nothing but sacrifice and loss across the spectrum, even on the villain side of things. Conversely, Trakina sacrificed her beauty after already becoming pretty ugly on the inside, as well as sacrificing everyone but her. But when it was finally time for Leo to be the sacrificial one for the sake of others, he did not flinch. It's the most complete season finale in the franchise as far as I'm concerned, and Lost Galaxy in general spoils us rotten with great characters across the board. But none feel more fully realized than everyone's favorite stowaway. It's hard to do it better than Jungle Fury. Every character matters, every character has their place, every one feels a little bit, or a lot of it, matured from where they started. But I'm here to tell you that a legitimate case can be made to call Casey Rhodes the greatest to ever do it. He's just that good. Quickly getting back to the Little Ranger That Could narrative that I will never get tired of, brings us the season-long character arc of the Cub-turned-Tiger Master. It's amazing that it took this long in a franchise about fighting to make fighting this pertinent to character growth, but here we are. You'd be hard-pressed to find 2 episodes in a row where Casey isn't advancing in some large or small way. Every time a new challenge comes up, he needs to prove to himself and to his cohorts that the faith Master Mao had in him wasn't misplaced. And just like most great Reds, his development brought out the best in several of the people around him. Theo became a better character because he ends up seeing some of himself in Casey, thanks to Lily. And RJ is able to come to terms with his own complicated past because he also sees some of himself in Casey and cherishes that mentor-student relationship a little bit above his others. That, and the team can kick ass a lot more effectively when he's not falling behind. And it's all because he had the right teachers, the right support system, the right team. He went so far because of them. But then, it all stops when he fails his master's test. But the cherry on top of a character so well realized is, once more, his relationship with the main villain. Daishi's growing power is also highlighted as a point of contrast to Casey, and that made saving Jared, while also going against everyone else's wishes, the perfect final test. Because it was in that moment, and really only that moment, that he couldn't rely on the people that pushed him so far. He could only rely on how far he could push himself. They could not have written a better culmination of everything that happened in this story than this face-off. Then, and only then, does Casey get to ascend to Master. Casey is the type of character you get when the season is well thought out steps and not loosely connected parts. And despite that, Jungle Fury still doesn't quite get the praise it very much deserves. So, let's take a minute and appreciate Casey Rhodes, because we may never see a Ranger this tightly written for ever again. The number 2, next to the embodiment of Ranger heroism. It feels weird, I know. Even as I record this, it still feels a little strange. I'll explain my stance further when we get to the now obvious number 1 choice, but for now, let's not let that take away from the Ranger I consider a personal inspiration. And it all comes down to Lightspeed Rescue's nuanced take on the concept of heroism, and how they convey that through a man whose personality is humble, but accomplishments are, quite frankly, mythic. That matters a lot, because despite his ability to pull off literally any heroic deed asked of him out of an unbreakable sense of righteousness, he's probably the most human, the most relatable of anyone on his team. And his team responds to that. Even Joel, of all people, is a far more level-headed Ranger over time because of Carter's gentle influence. He never had to bark orders. He never had to demand respect. You interact with this man for 5 minutes, and you'd willingly run through walls for him. And a lot of that also comes from his tireless work ethic. In a way, Carter is all of us, looking up to and trying to match his hero, same as the heroes we all have, fictional or otherwise. And it's through his hard work and desire to become what he sees in Captain Mitchell that he starts off the show already most of the way there. And once he does slap on the Morpher, that narrative doesn't change. Always working, always pushing himself, and when duty calls, no matter what time the phone rings, he's always there to answer it with boundless resolve. Carter didn't have the powerful character arcs or pronounced hero's journeys that the Reds surrounding him did, but he never needed it, because he represents something just as notable, an ideal to strive for, an example for others to follow. It's not just the fact that he didn't hesitate when monsters were on the loose. It's not just the fact that he sacrificed himself Lord knows how many times without a second thought. It's not just the fact that when the day was saved, he still rushed back into action without a Morpher. It's all of that, through the idea that he always sees himself as just another guy, trying to do the right thing, and never as this larger-than-life figure people like me see him as. And that detail counts for a lot to me. But there is one Ranger that, by the slimmest of margins, did it as great as you can do it wearing this particular color. But before we get to him, let's bring in some honorable mentions. Wesley Collins. Let me put it this way. Jen may very well be the best Pink Ranger ever, but damn near everything that works and works well about Time Force traces back to Wes. Once again, we find ourselves back to the narrative of a Red Ranger forced to grow into a role he never really asked for, but has anyways. But I think because of how Wes's dynamics with other characters are presented and developed, the concept might be at its peak here. He doesn't just embody the grander narrative about how destiny truly is a very adjustable concept, and where you end up really depends on who you decide to be, what internal changes you decide to make. His progress forces every noteworthy character to see that concept for themselves. We see Jen slowly becoming more personable, while also still being harsh by necessity to get the best out of Wes. They're both allowed to be right and wrong, as the Jen-led team steadily becomes a more co-captain team over time. Hell, even Alex gets to learn this lesson when he comes to town and recognizes just how different his old team is, and just how much they need the Red they already had. We see Mr. Collins rethink his own values in conjunction with his son's hero work. The man doesn't back down to, of all people, Rancic, who has no qualms about killing people, and all to make a powerful statement about just how much Wes does mean to him, and how impactful his decision to move out really was. And Eric, he already changed his destiny. He's living proof of Time Force's defining message the second we understand his backstory. But for all his stubbornness, even he eventually recognizes that yes, they actually do have a lot in common. That's not just Eric waking up one day and realizing how much of a dick he's been acting like. Their resolution, their friendship, was literally years in the making, and their reconciling is one of the most earned character moments in all of Power Rangers, and probably in most of Toku. Even Trip, who is mostly an observer slash little brother for Wes, gets to see his initial faith in Wes justified, which only serves to make him a much more useful character down the line, helping Nadira to, you guessed it, change her destiny. All of these patiently progressed, well-developed character arcs are made possible because Wes recognized that he was wrong, and worked every day after the fact to prove that he could fight for more than just himself. But he didn't stop there. He then realized how misled his father has been before taking a chance and betting everything on being a hero. And on top of this hefty, full-page long without spaces resume of his, he's just a joy to watch. His personality jumps off the screen in damn near every scene, and his chemistry with all of the characters I mentioned still stands as some of the most believable dynamics in the franchise. The romance isn't even super important in the grand scheme of things, but even that is done better than literally any other Ranger relationship. And that's what it really comes down to. Everything just works when Wes is involved. Not by magic or dumb luck or by being stupidly overpowered, but because his genuine nature pulls people in. I mean, he lived in the lap of luxury for years, but still wanted to be friends with Eric back then, and never bitches about doing odd jobs now. That's just class. Wes is simply everything you could want in a Ranger and then some, and it's in that little bit extra that creates the slightest of separations between him and my personal favorite Red in Carter. His impact helped make the characters around him all-time greats too, and the same can't really be said for the Lightspeed Rescue supporting cast, who are more carried by Carter than carried forward as people. And for me, that makes Wes Collins the greatest Red Ranger of all time. But, as always, share your own thoughts down below on who you think are the best Rangers in Red. It's kind of nice to finally have given my thoughts on every Ranger color, but I am considering updating my old Green and Black Ranger video because I'm not fully satisfied with how that one came out compared to my more recent top 10s. And if you want to talk more about this list, or anything in particular, join my very lively Discord channel where I spend way too much of my time. And as always, thanks for watching.